Good evening. This is Blanche Wiesen Cook, and this is Women and the World in the 1980s. I'm really privileged to have as my guest tonight on the subject of Grenada, on the atrocities in Grenada, Audre Lorde and Zala Chandler. Audre Lorde, who has been on this program before, is a poet, a novelist, the author of the recent book Zami, which is now out in a new edition. And Audre's work has for, well, all of your life really, actually been informed by Grenada. Audre's considers Grenada her home. Her family is from Grenada, and she has family in Grenada. Zala Chandler, who, Dr. Chandler, I don't have to call you Dr. Chandler,
No, just Zala.
but I will call you Zala. Chandler is a faculty member at Medgar Evers, and indeed, Zala is a woman who makes one of some of the best connections, and what this program is going to be about is connections. I'm really privileged to have two vigorous women who make the best connections in this country, making them at a time when we are getting a great deal of misinformation. In fact, I think that the situation in Grenada today is probably a primary example of America's use of misinformation as it bounces around the planet saying, the Russians are the architects of misinformation. As many of you know, I work with the Fund for Open Information and Accountability, FOIA, Inc., and we have just printed a fact sheet going through the kind of misinformation that has come out on Grenada, some of which we're going to talk about today. But I want to just start the program by raising some of the fundamental issues that we've all been I think the word that comes to mind, treated to, sort of like a party favor, which are just, kind of stunning, distorted, and outrageous lies, which we attempt to answer in our fact sheet. Were the students in danger? Was the airport really closed? Who invited the United States to intervene, an intervention that not one single member of our own NATO alliance, our closest allies, approved of, and 100 nations in the United Nations condemned, and is in fact, as we all know now, illegal in terms of the United Nations Charter and the Organization of American States. Was the takeover imminent by the Soviet Union and Cuba? Was there any real danger? And here I'd like to pause to point out that all of you out there who want to get more information about what's going on might well be reading right now the British press, since Margaret Thatcher, who is not habitually critical of Ronald Reagan, is coming in with some of the most vigorous criticism, since indeed she has been, what can we say? I mean, she's been demoted as titular head or nominal head of the British Commonwealth, of which Grenada is a member. And Margaret Thatcher says this simply will not do. She didn't approve of it. There was no danger. And she is worried that war, both in Grenada and in Lebanon, in this recourse to military bombardment, is going to lead to a breakup of the alliance. And in England, for the first time, the left and the right are united in its anti-Americanism. So one would do well to read the British press at this point, as well as, of course, the French press, which has been vigorously critical, or the Canadian press, or any press other than our own, which is more and more controlled.
What do you suggest?
Well,
British papers?
The British, actually, the Financial Times of London, as conservative as it is, has had the full statements made by Margaret Thatcher, and the London Times, as conservative as it is, has had full statements made by Margaret Thatcher, which have not appeared, the full statements have not appeared in any single United States paper, which I think is rather amazing, Audrey. And then just to run down very briefly, and then I'll turn this over to you, Audre Lorde, and to Zala Chandler, just some more of the incredible misinformation that we try to deal with in our FOIA pamphlet, the shocking arsenal of modern weapons. Allegedly, we went in there. And I think we have to just pause to say something about the fact the press has not been allowed freely to roam in Grenada. And so this shocking arsenal of modern weapons has not been found by the press. And indeed, when the press went to check this shocking arsenal of modern weapons, a whole cache of 1870 Remington rifles was discovered. I think that's sort of quaint, but certainly a major event in terms of misinformation. Where did all the Cubans go? We said there were 1,200 Cubans. There were less than 600 Cubans. Were they military? I mean, these are the questions that we really need to substantiate, and of course, over time, we will. And fundamentally, the basic issue, making Grenada safe for democracy, and that whole issue of what it means. What does it mean to make Grenada safe for democracy when Bishop is assassinated? Before Bishop, there was the outrageous Geary regime, which I know, Audre, you can talk about a little bit. And then finally, for me, the thing that is not only puzzling, but I think really one must use the word savage, the fact that Grenadian casualties have not been reported. Not only is there no body count, maybe there are mass graves, maybe there aren't, but you hear how many U.S. Soldiers and Marines have been wounded and killed. You hear how many Cubans, and that number, by the way, changes daily. But what about the people of Grenada? You know, there was a war going on for at least a week, and Grenada was bombed. We now know, because this did appear in the U.S. press, that thousands and thousands of dollars worth of property damage has been submitted to the U.S.
Property damage, damage to trees, damage to nutmeg groves, which of course is the primary economic exportable product of Grenada. And you have to remember at the same time that it takes 8 years for a nutmeg tree to bear. It takes 25 years for it to come into full production. So if you wipe out a grove of trees, if you fire them, supposedly looking for non-existent Cubans, it is 25 years before that will bear again. And this is the livelihood of people who live in small villages, 110,000 people. And I see most of the misinformation that is going on, one of the primary points of it is to remove from our consciousness completely the fact that we are talking about human beings. And it's fairly easy for most of America not to deal with it because it's quite obvious that they are black. And I think the ways in which the atrocity that has happened in Grenada is really a message also to black people all over this world, and in particular in this hemisphere, I think is also very obvious. But very little has been said about this.
Audre, I want to ask you two specific questions, and then I would like you to talk further about what I think really is the terrorist use of Grenada in this political climate. You've been to Grenada. You visited Grenada. I think most people don't know what Grenada looks like. I think they don't know how small it is. When the very tiny island of Carriacou was invaded about 3 days after Grenada, the larger island was grenaded. I thought of you because you have, of course, that wonderful scene in your book, Zami, about Carriacou. I wonder if you would describe Grenada for us, and also if you would talk, we once were having a conversation and you mentioned the destruction of banana plantations that Bishop had introduced. He had taken over some of the old, slave plantations and created these cooperatives. And these banana plantations were destroyed during this bombardment. Now, we've heard nothing of this. So those are two parts to one question. I see you're taking out your book. Are you going to read to us about Carriacou?
Well,
would you? That would be just dandy.
It's just that, you know, when people mispronounce, first of all, it was a week and a half before commentators on CBS could learn that Grenada is not Grenada.
Which is in Spain.
To have, how do you pronounce? And I think we really have to pay attention to the ways in which the message is delivered over and over again. This is really not a place of any import. This is not a place where human beings live. We do not need to deal with the realities of what would it feel like to have Washington, D.C. invaded by a foreign power. And even that is not can't be compared, because Grenada is a group of small little villages. St. George's is the only really large town on the whole island. Grenville is half a block.
And consists of a post office and
a general store, post office, a general store, and Maquis Island, which is off in the bay, and a beach. Beautiful beaches. Grenada is the most, for me, having visited some of the West Indian islands, Grenada is the most beautiful of the islands. Kairaku is a little gem, but it's 13 miles, 13 square miles. And so it is so bizarre when you open the New York Post or the Times and see the troops hit the beaches. I mean, what they're talking about is, little old black women walking along beaches in the morning with their rubber boots and their cutlass cutting down coconut palms that grow, cutting coconuts from the palms that grow on the beach.
It's a very poor island, too.
It's a very poor island. It's one of the poorest islands. And yet, we have to remember, too, that even though it was one of the poorest islands, during the time that Maurice Bishop was prime minister, it developed the most forward, healthiest economy of any of the island states in the Caribbean. I mean, this is why Grenada had to be made an example of, that it be run by black, English-speaking socialist people could not be born by this country. What kind of message would it be sending to black people in America? And this is why I say that I see Grenada in a worldview. I also see it as a very specific racist act.
Audrey, didn't Maurice Bishop say, I mean, you teach at Hunter, and I think it was at Hunter that Maurice Bishop spoke this summer and said, I know I am a target of the CIA, of the United States, and I am dangerous, and what makes me dangerous is that I am an English-speaking socialist, an English-speaking Marxist.
Black, right? African, Caribbean, and that is very, very important. That is, Zala, don't you feel that this is an area that has received very little relative attention in terms of Grenada for the size of the island and for 110,000 people? The United States of America has made, a number of very, very clear statements, it seems to me. And I think we will be hearing those statements beginning to be articulated for many, many years to come.
I think that becomes the bottom line of the problem because of the possible influence that Maurice Bishop could have on 40 million African American people in this country became somewhat devastating to the people that rule this country. It had some tremendous possibilities. The idea of socialism, for the first time to a number of African American people, became a very conceivable idea. Here was an island that was making it work. Mm-hmm. Here was an island that was doing something very different from what was being done in Cuba, what was being done in the Soviet Union, what was being done in any other place in the world. It was doing its own thing, talking about self-determination and reaching out to those of us here to ask us the question, why aren't we being about the same thing?
If it can happen in Grenada, yes, it made it much, much more possible that we could also do it here.
Yeah. Let me ask you, Zala, you had a program at Medgar Evers College in which the students and community people responded to this invasion of Grenada. We have been told in the establishment press that everybody in Brooklyn really has jumped for joy and just loves the fact that Reagan came to the rescue. When we talk to our students, when we talk to other people, we don't have the sense of unanimity that we're getting on Reagan, out of the Reagan networks or out of Reagan's mouth. What has been your sense of the response of people?
Let me preface my statement about the response toward the situation in Grenada with the fact that I am totally dismayed that in 1983 we would even have to have a discussion within the black community about the intentions of a Ronald Reagan, whose policies, whose program, whose statements, all the way up until now have proven to us his total disdain for black people. And that we would even consider him going into Grenada as a savior of black people is something that, of course, just grips my very being. But I think it is important that the public realize that any statements in favor of the invasion were in the main coming from people that loved Maurice Bishop, that loved the revolution in Grenada, and that the welcoming of the invading troops was because they felt that the people who had killed Maurice Bishop and had temporarily put a halt to the revolution would be punished. The question that we began to ask, people that came with a position applauding Reagan was indeed, did people feel that it was possible that Ronald Reagan and the CIA could have been responsible for the murder of Maurice Bishop in the first place? When Maurice Bishop came here, he told us, as you had said before, of the CIA intentions. But, this is the same government that says it went into Grenada to save, quote-unquote, American lives, but somehow didn't feel those American lives were worth meeting with Maurice Bishop when he was alive, to try to set up some relations.
Right, refused to meet with Maurice Bishop when he came here.
And the sentiment that I've been getting from the Caribbean community in Brooklyn and at Medgar Evers College, which is 50% Caribbean and African from the continent of Africa, has been that any type of applauding for Ronald Reagan's invasion of Grenada is only a result of the anger and the pain that people are feeling about the murder of Maurice Bishop, and not because they wanted to see America come into Grenada to save them from socialism. In fact, many statements had said that the United States, which had planned to invade Grenada back in 1981, was looking for an opportunity to invade. They knew they couldn't invade Grenada while Maurice Bishop was alive, because all of the people, men, women, and children, would have fought
would
to
have
the last
risen
person.
to the last person. So how do you set up, when you consider the kind of strategizing that goes on in the CIA, how do you set up a situation that will allow the United States to put into practice a plan it had been practicing out on Vieques, bombing hell out of Vieques, calling it Amber of the Amberdeens, for 2 years? So, obviously, if it had been put into practice when Maurice Bishop was there, there would have been an island-wide uprising. So you arrange the scenario, right, so that it makes it possible for people to be totally confused at this point, and I think a lot of that is happening in Grenada. But also, I tuned in to a program last night, and I only saw the last 2 minutes of it, unfortunately. But there was a black woman there who had just come back from Grenada, who had interviewed people on the streets in Grenville and Subisi and these places up on the East Coast, right near Pearl's Airport. And she said a number of the people had said, of course, yes, we're really glad you're here. And one woman said to her, after this was all over, pulled her aside and said, but what do you expect us to tell you? We will tell you anything you want to hear. We will tell you anything you want.
Especially
we are
at
your
troops.
mercy right now, and we know it.
We see your troops, your guns, your landing gear.
Can you imagine what it is like to see and to have these people who, as I say, cutlasses, right, and really have to deal with AK-47s piling down, being aimed at their houses, residences being scraped, right, being fired, dead people burned to death beside their road?
I think that, yes.
Can I just respond to that? Even when we stop and talk about the outdated arsenal, that somewhat becomes insulting because, again, to me, this is a reflection of racism. Grenada was a sovereign state
And had
a right to have arms. I listened to a program on the radio the other morning where a woman was here from Britain talking about the number of bases the United States has in Britain. And she was comparing Britain to the state of Montana and saying, can you imagine, having 120 bases in one state in the United States? You would feel that you were occupied by a foreign power. So the United States has troops and arms all over this world. And it's expected by so many people. And here you have a tiny island that has, quote unquote, an outdated arsenal. But even before finding out that it was an outdated arsenal, if it had been a totally up-to-date arsenal, we should be saying that it is their right to have those weapons.
They have to defend themselves, particularly when the biggest power in the Western Hemisphere has been practicing, has been play-acting, wiping them out of existence for 2 years.
And it's only racism that says you don't have that right.
And we talk about Cuban workers, Cuban forces. The United States has 9,300 men and 162 tanks in Panama. It's got 56 quote-unquote advisors in El Salvador, 500 or more troops in Honduras. I mean, where...
And Nicaragua is under attack.
That's right,
I mean, I
under
think
attack from
Honduras and El Salvador.
And at the same time, we are saying, that this was an imminent threat, that Grenada, in protecting herself, in seeking to remain as autonomous as she could, getting help wherever she could, didn't have a right to have arms to defend her own shores?
I think we've really, both of you really touched on the absolutely crucial issue here, which is national sovereignty versus the crudest kind of militarized colonialism. And that is what's going on. The island of Grenada, independent country, has been recolonized. The face dressing of having a governor general appointed by Britain is a joke. He had no authority, but now he has authority, and we recognize him. The credentials debate at the United Nations, should the former bishop-appointed UN representative be seated, which nobody wants to debate because it will reveal the absurdity of this absolute invasion, colonial, really 19th century imperial style.
The invitation for which was drafted in Washington and sent down to other islands.
Now, I want to pause over the Operation Amber, Audrey, which you've just started to talk about. Operation Amber is an operation that we know the facts of. The facts or the game plan for what was going to happen in Grenada, as you mentioned, the island of Amber, codenamed Amber, in the Amberines, like Grenada in the Grenadines. When the popular leader is assassinated and there's political upheaval and the U.S. has to invade to save American citizens from an Iranian-style hostage situation. Now, that's the game plan that was printed, operated upon on the tiny Puerto Rican island of Vieques, which is being bombed off the face of the earth as well by our militarized uses of Vieques. I mean, Vieques is just a bombing pad at this point. And so the game plan is there, and all of us need to know about this game plan. Now, in addition to this game plan, I've been very puzzled until, and I know that you both have as well because we've talked about it, I am talking to Audre Lorde and Zala Chandler, about the just kind of agreement. Even in the very splendid article by Alexander Coburn in the Village Voice on Grenada, the agreement that somehow Cord and General Austin were Soviet, Cuban, radical super Marxists who wanted to overthrow Bishop, and this wasn't a CIA plot, the overthrow of Bishop, at all. Now, a very tiny little article appeared in the November 4th issue of the New York Times, the headline for which is "Exiles in Miami Portray Cuban Plot on Grenada." That's the headline. Except if you look down through this article, Exiles in Miami, now we're talking about Cuban exiles in Miami. These are people we've always believed, as opposed to Cubans in Cuba, who we always think of as bad. These are Cubans we always think of as good. In the New York Times, I'm going to read the last paragraph. This is from page 18, the first section of November 4, New York Times. According to the exiles, Fidel Castro was concerned that General Austin, whom the Cubans, these are the bad Cubans, the Cuban Cubans, did not trust, was capable of making a deal with the United States. Subsequently, the Florida Cubans, the exiles say, some 20 Cuban officers led by a Colonel Tortolo, who was not further identified, were sent urgently to Grenada with orders to overthrow the Austin junta, using, if needed, some of the Cuban workers. Now, I find that fascinating. I find that fascinating because that would, of course, be the key to what we should be exploring, namely, how did Maurice Bishop get assassinated? And as always, we as observers of social life and of history and politics have to ask
who profits
whose
from.
interests are served.
That's right.
And why was this done at this time and by who? Well, if you look at whose interests were served, I mean, it doesn't serve the Grenadians. It doesn't serve Marxism. It doesn't serve the Soviet Union or the Cubans. It serves the CIA, which had this game plan ready and eager to trot. And now I think we have a clue. And I think we should all be very suspicious of the cover story, which is bizarre. It's a bizarre cover story. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But this makes a lot more sense, that General Austin was a very ambitious man and might have gone to the CIA for an alliance. Of course, there are people from Grenada who say they haven't seen Cord in weeks and weeks and weeks.
Yes, but he has been both Bernard Cord and his wife Phyllis, I understand, were being held on an American ship, had been captured, were being held on an American ship, and supposedly have been returned. I think it was yesterday, wasn't it, Zala?
It was a couple of days away.
To a prison.
I think the unfortunate part of this is that the American public has a tendency in the beginning of an event to follow it very closely, to look for news articles on Grenada. And of course, weeks from now, as the real information begins to come to us on page 37 of the Times in a small
That's
article
right.
that begins to give us
not indexed.
a Cord Austin CIA link, the public will have moved on to another issue. So what remains in their minds are these fanatical, devil, Marxist who killed Maurice Bishop, that now all of a sudden is a moderate that Reagan loved. Because we have to remember that Reagan refused to even meet with the man, let alone set up any kind of diplomatic relations with him. But that now an article would come out that suggests that there's a link between Austin and the U.S. State Department appears when the majority of people have already had set in their minds who actually killed Maurice Bishop, the Russians and the Cubans, as opposed to something being planned by the State Department, as we said, because they could not have invaded Grenada had Maurice Bishop still been alive. And I think that represents the real danger. And of course, another concern of mine has been what our reaction, what the United States public reaction is to the United States invading another country, wherever it is. We see people all over the world, standing up and saying, you can't do this. And they're not saying you can't do this because they necessarily love the Soviet Union or they love Cuba or they love any countries of socialist thinking and action. They're saying you can't do this because they respect the sovereign rights of different nations. And our response in this country has, as usual, been very minimal. Because while I'm very grateful that we had 10,000 people demonstrate at the United Nations and say no, to the invasion, 10,000 is by far a drop in the bucket. In fact, Ronald Reagan will go and play golf on a segregated golf course and feel very comfortable about 10,000 people marching because that means nothing to him. They don't even, 100,000 people can march on Washington, D.C., and you won't even find it in a Washington, D.C. newspaper. I've had that experience.
Well, I think that we're really witnessing the demise of a kind of public conscience here. I mean, this is really 19th century imperialism. It's, what can we call it, cowboy
I think it's 19th
imperialism.
century imperialism, and I think it is somehow sweetened to the mass of the large amount of the public in this country has been softened, and I'm speaking now of white middle America, finds this eminently acceptable or finds it very easy not to question the human and moral lack of structure beneath this because, again, it happened to black people. And I think the consistent wearing away of consciousness, the very, very conscious plan on the part of the Reagan administration to reduce black people in this country, to reduce black people worldwide. For instance, his insistence upon championing that he is a champion of, on one hand, human rights, and on the other hand, being able to sit down and applaud what is happening in South Africa, to refuse to see what a monstrosity, right, apartheid is. That he could even speak of constructive engagement with white South African government is bizarre. This is something, all of these things are hooked together. Racism is not merely a little blemish that happens in this country. It's not really, a moral vice. It is a worldwide economic, institutional structure of oppression. And I think until we begin to see all of these things functioning within that, it is not certainly by accident that Grenada is a black island. And it is also not by accident, therefore, that the large masses of white American public find it much easier to accept this kind of action against a black nation than if it were not.
Audre, I'd like to use what you just said, which is, I think, very much the core of what is really fundamentally diseased currently and has been for a very long time in our culture, to ask Zala to talk a little bit about Medgar Evers, which I think, like Grenada in the world, is for New York City a symbol of the kind of violence that, not only violence, but violence and indignity and daily abuse that is acceptable when it concerns black people. Medgar Evers is, well, I mean, I don't know how to describe it. It is certainly the most neglected and abused of the CUNY colleges. But it's more than that.
It's also one of the most exciting things that's happening in CUNY.
It is also one of the most exciting things that happen, and that's because there are people like Zala Chandler and your incredible support group that has been created at Medgar Evers to make it the kind of college that its faculty and its students not only deserve but would have were it not for the racism that keeps Medgar Evers a violated institution.
And I think that there's a connection between Grenada and Medgar Evers, because you're talking about a group of people that are articulating self-determination and a right to know your history and a right to quality education. And at Medgar Evers, we're talking about a right to basics that the other colleges don't even have to talk about. Basics like chairs in every classroom, chalk in every classroom, erasers for the blackboards. If you ride down Carroll Street, which is where the entrance of Medgar Evers is found, most folks will pass Medgar Evers by because there's no entrance. Our entrance has been demolished, supposedly so that it can be improved, for handicapped to come into Medgar Evers, which most of us would applaud, except for the fact that the elevators in Medgar Evers are broken most of the time. So even if a handicapped person could come into the building, they wouldn't be able to get up the stairs because the elevators, remain broken. But Medgar Evers is the stepchild of CUNY. When we can go a stone's throw away to Brooklyn College or New York Tech and just see the facilities alone, that it's a stepchild of CUNY. But then when you look at the programs, 80% of the students at Medgar Evers are enrolled in a 4-year degree program, whereas our school is a 2-year college, a community college. So you have faculty that are teaching course loads equivalent to the 4-year to community colleges, while we're actually serving students that are enrolled in 4-year degree programs. We are, in capital letters, the stepchild, and the racism that we see taking place in relationship to Grenada is the racism that we see taking place at Medgar Evers. And like Grenada, we have a group of people there determined to turn it around, determined that we will receive what we deserve inside of City University, inside of Central Brooklyn. Central Brooklyn has the largest black population in this country. Largest concentration of black people in this country, in this hemisphere, in fact. And we can talk about a college that's serving this large population existing in the state that Medgar Evers exists in, you must begin to say this is intolerable. It's exciting, as Audrey said, because they're a group of people committed to the idea of having a college named after Medgar Evers, a man who gave his life so that black people would receive the equality that we deserve, not that we are asking for, that we deserve, that we demand in this country.
Right. Remind our listeners who Medgar Evers was.
Medgar Evers was a civil rights worker in the state of Mississippi who was killed because he stood for the rights of black people. Killed, and the wife of Medgar Evers ends her book by saying, the man who killed my husband is still alive, breathing, happy, somewhere in the state of Mississippi. So here we have a college that was named after Medgar Evers, but then you have students, a majority of students who have no idea who Medgar Evers was. And we're saying that's intolerable. We're saying there must be some type of program at Medgar Evers College that would inform the entire college population, indeed, the entire community surrounding that college, not only who Medgar Evers was, but of the rich history that black people worldwide have experienced. And that, Grenada, the discussions about Grenada, the current president of Medgar Evers, who's an acting president, got on national television and said that he supported the invasion of Grenada in the name of Medgar Evers College. And
so outrageous.
This is outrageous. We
so
are outraged that, he would have the nerve to do this. But we understand also that it was no accident that the news media, was able to find him and that he would make a statement like this, because this school has been a school that has been in the news media and been cited for being a place where people are standing up saying enough is enough. And, it's important now to present Medgar as a place that's been quieted down and everything is okay, and we have elements there that would support the invasion of Grenada. And I'm here to say that Medgar Evers does not support the invasion of Grenada. In fact, those of us who heard him, were outraged by the statements, and people visited his office to express this outrage and demanded that he make a public apology, and let the public know that he was speaking for himself. Mm-hmm. Fortunately, we will be getting rid of him as a president very soon, because CUNY is in the process of searching for a permanent president for the college. And we have demanded that we have a black woman as the permanent president to serve a 76% female, 95% black student population at the school.
That's great. Do you want to talk a little bit about that quest for a new president, which I know is really very much a current political situation?
Well, we're demanding, of course, that the finalists come on the campus and actually talk with the students and the faculty, because when this acting president, the supporter of the invasion in Grenada, was brought to the campus, as is the tradition of paternalism, none of the faculty nor students at the college were consulted. The board just sent him to us and said, this is your acting president, after we had waged a tremendous struggle to get rid of a president prior to him. At this stage, we're saying that anyone that will come to that campus in the capacity of permanent president must be someone that's acceptable to the community at Medgar Evers College. And of course, this is a tremendous, tremendous battle, because we are talking about self-determination. And of course, the board, CUNY Board of Trustees, and the Chancellor, Joseph Murphy, has the ultimate decision of who will be the permanent president of the college. But we're saying you can't make that decision without some input from the people that this president will be presiding over. You can't appoint a governor general, as Britain and the United States is attempting to do, in Grenada.
Zala, as you speak, the question of connectedness between Grenada and Medgar Evers, between brute force and what the people not only want and need, but could have, were they not consistently abused and violated, and finally, in the case of what has been going on not only in Grenada but in all of Central America, killed when they begin to seek and take responsibility for their own lives. And the challenge for all of us is finally to take personal responsibility and demand that we go beyond the New York Times headlines. The New York Times headlines, right on the opposite page of that thing I was reading before about the possible U.S. Link with General Austin, is Capitol Hill outcry, meaning the congressional outcry, softens as public support swells. Well, whether or not there is public support is a question. When you start talking to people as you did, Zala, and what the public support was for was out of the outrage over the death of Maurice Bishop, who, as you said, Audrey, had almost unanimous, if not indeed the unanimous support of the people of Grenada. And I think when something fine and decent and life-enhancing emerges, well, then we have a great responsibility, number one, to cherish it, but number two, to cherish its memory in a constant, continual, ongoing struggle against what I think it's pretty clear are the forces of evil. Ronald Reagan talks about the evil empire, and I think there's a lot of disagreement about what the evil empire currently
well, the use
in
of
the
words,
world.
the way words are used, the way language is used and turned around so that he can go on national television and say, well, I've decided we won't call it an invasion anymore. We'll call it a rescue, right? And smile and wait for. And the newspapers begin to pick this up, right? Some of them. The ways in which language is used against us, the ways in which silence is used against us. I would like to make a plea to everyone who is listening to, as we talk about the kinds of distortions that have happened in Grenada, as we talk about the kind of silence that blankets the battle that's going on at Medgar Evers, we also be aware of the kinds of silence that blankets so much of what happens in the black world.
And in the women's world.
In the women's world.
Wherever
in the world
anybody.
of any of the disenfranchised groups, any of the groups that are even potentially threatening.
Or potentially seeking their own individual and group integrity.
So that I'd have to say again, I mean, the consciousness of what is happening in South Africa, and I come back to that again only because I have been reading, for instance, the African National Congress news briefings, and know the kind of storms that are happening, the constant killings, the reprisals against the refusal of people in the Transkei and Ciskei to accept the kinds of oppressions that are happening. We hear nothing about this in this country. We hear nothing about the people, the kids, the youth of Grenada who took to the hills, that it is not Cubans who know the ins and outs of Harvey's Vale in Kairaku and all the rest of it. It is the people who grew up there. And the people who were fighting in the hills were not Cubans, but were young people who could not accept the fact of a foreign invader. I mean, we hear nothing about all of this.
And
I feel that it really is something that every person must take as a personal responsibility to get information beyond the New York Times, to get information beyond CBS Evening News.
I think it's important in this case to note that for the first time in my memory, the New York Times didn't even report the United Nations vote. We know vaguely 100 nations voted against. They did not. So the press corps has not been permitted into a war zone for the first time in my memory. And that's a radical departure in terms of misinformation. Why was the entire global press corps barred, blockaded? I think because they were setting the stage, as you indicated, setting the stage, finding the guns, finding the Cubans, finding the Soviets and Koreas, setting the stage and also hiding what it looks like when a tiny and very beautiful island is bombed by great big military planes from the air. What it looks like on the ground. So we were barred.
Not only that, but setting the stage for when the smoke clears and we actually see that there are a lot of Grenadan bodies, saying that indeed these people were killed before the invasion. Because, we keep hearing now about these mass graves, right? So the people that are perhaps being killed as a result of the invasion will now be bodies attributed to Maurice Bishop's government or, Accord in Austin.
Right. Audrey, you were going to read, I think, before a description from your book of Grenada or Kairaku. Would you do that? This is from Audrey's recent Biomythography, did I get that right?
Yes.
Which has now been re-released by Crossing Press in a beautiful new edition with a very youthful picture, I hasten to add, of Audrey, taken, I won't say how many years ago, you can if you like, but the new book is Zami.
Grenada, my mother always spoke about Grenada and Carriacou, where she was born, in almost mythic terms. And this was the place where we would always return to. And Zami is a word used in Carriacou for women who work and love together, and that is the name of the book. This is a small section from... Then my mother would tell us wonderful stories about Noel's Hill in Grenville, Grenada, which overlooked the Caribbean Sea. She told us stories about Carriacou, where she'd been born, amid the heavy smell of limes. She told us about the plants that healed and about plants that drove you crazy, but none of it made too much sense to us children because we had never seen them. But home was a far way off. We all knew that. A place I had never been to, but knew well out of my mother's mouth. Because she breathed, exuded, hummed the fruit smell of Noel's Hill, morning fresh and noon hot, and I spun visions of sapodilla and mango as a net over my Harlem tenement, in the snoring darkness rank with nightmare sweat, made bearable because it was not all. Some day we would walk the hills of Grenville. Some day we would walk in Grenada, and when the wind blew right, we would smell the lime trees of Carriacou, the spice island off the coast. We would listen to the sea drum up on Kikumjeni, the reef whose loud voice split the night when the sea waves beat upon her sides. Carriacou. Carriacou, a magic name like cinnamon, nutmeg, mace, the delectable little squares of guava jelly, lovingly wrapped in tiny pieces of crazy quilt wax paper cut precisely from bread wrappers. Carriacou, which was not listed in the index of the school atlas, nor in the Junior American World Gazette, nor ever appeared on any map that I could ever find. And so when I hunted for this magic place during my geography lessons, I never found it, and sometimes I came to believe that my mother's geography was a fantasy, or maybe just too old-fashioned. But under it all, as I was growing up, home was a sweet place somewhere else, which they had not yet managed to capture on paper, nor to throttle, nor to bind up between the pages of a school book. It was our own, our truly private paradise of bluggo and breadfruit hanging from the trees, of nutmeg and lime, of sapodillo, of tonka bean and red and yellow paradise plums.
Thank you, Audrey. There's something very bitter, which maybe you would like to talk about discovering Carriacou only after we've invaded it. But
well, I didn't discover it when we invaded it.
No, not you. I mean, the
so many
U.S.
people.
press.
I'm really glad, in the pain that I felt throughout this, I thought to myself, I'm really glad that in Zami I talked about Grenada and Carriacou. I'm really glad that there are women out there who, when they see this name, realize that it's not just a stone or a rock or a floating sponge in the American bathtub to be grabbed out and squeezed of whatever it wants. I'm really glad that I hope that this book has helped to make Grenada and Carriacou real to some people.
Well, as one of the great fans of that book, I can assure you that Zami does make Carriacou and Grenada, and indeed the West Indian struggle for dignity, survival, triumph, very real for people. We don't have very much time, and I feel very privileged to be with Audre Lorde and Zala Chandler, who are two women who have devoted their lives to real understanding in a world where that becomes increasingly a very precious commodity. I would like both of you, I don't know what to say, wing it. What do you think is going to be the great call for the next few months at this moment when Grenada is still clearly going to stay invaded? I mean, we're now talking about staying on the island of Grenada until legitimate government is established. Well, what is that legitimate government, and where is it going to come from as U.S. Marines? And if you've seen pictures of U.S. Marines with their cigarettes dangling from their mouths, their guns in hand in individual homes.
I think of Maurice Bishop saying in June, they may invade us, but they will find it easier to land than to leave.
Okay.
I like that.
They're gonna yeah.
I think that in my final words, I would really like to just concentrate on, what do we do? What do we do when there's a person very close to the image in my mind's eye of Hitler sitting in the White House? What do we do? And I think that we talked a little bit about, it is our responsibility to be informed, and not just be informed by the evening news or the most popular newspapers, but to be informed, read those, listen to the news in the evening, but also seek out other sources. And that goes for not just Grenada, but Medgar Evers College. But beyond being informed, to know and do nothing is almost worse than not knowing at all. And I believe that it is our responsibility that wherever we see an injustice taking place, that we stand up and refuse to see it happen. That there'll be those of us that will march, there will be those of us that will write, and there will be those of us that will exercise our right to civil disobedience, and say that in the name of standing up against injustice, I will sit in the middle of this road and make sure that this corporation's truck does not pass for whatever number of hours it takes, to make sure that they suffer a little bit for what they're doing to my people the world over.
I just want to say about that, we're getting a sign that we have 5 minutes to wrap up. People are saying, well, why write letters to this administration? He's not going to tell the truth about letters anyway. But what we see is that they come out, the right wing, and you use the word Hitler. I think it's not inappropriate to use the word Hitler. I think that if we look at our foreign policy, I'm not saying we have a fascist country. I don't think we can say that. But I think if we look at our foreign policy the world over, we have, and we have to say it, a fascist foreign policy. Who makes decisions to invade other people's countries? Where are we right now bombing the little villages? If you've seen pictures of Nicaragua, and if you haven't seen pictures of Nicaragua, go to a library and look at pictures of Nicaragua. It's a very poor country. The streets are unpaved. There is very little sanitation, except the sanitation the Sandinistas have piped in very recently. And here we are again, bombing. Mm-hmm. We may invade imminently. We may not. Mm-hmm. We may go through with these covert activities. Mm-hmm. But it's very important that we, all of us who disagree, who disapprove, inform ourselves and protest in a great range of ways that are available to us.
Mm-hmm. And I think that wherever we find ourselves, as Zala said, wherever we find ourselves, whatever is possible, each one of us must do. I think letter writing is important. I think one of the effects of the kinds of silences, the kinds of misinformation and so forth, is to make the American people, those of us who do think, those of us who really wish and believe in change, to make us silent, to make us so despairing, to make us doubt our efficacy so much. As I'm constantly telling my students, you have to remember the rumor you can't fight City Hall is a rumor circulated by City Hall for its own benefit. So whenever we begin to feel so unable to make any effect, we cease making any action. And I think it's very, very important for each one of us to recognize that, yes, our power is relative, but it is still powerful, that until we are dead, we are still able to make some kind of effect. And it is very, very important to make that effect, no matter how small it is.
Mm-hmm. Can I just deal with something very concrete that relates to Medgar Evers? And I'm sure that my student population would be very angry if I didn't say this. That people, we have demanded a black female for president. And I'm saying that people can pick up a phone, get the number, I don't have it now, get the number from information and call the Board of Higher Education, Chancellor Joseph Murphy, and say that it is about time that there be another female president within CUNY, and in this instance, because we are a black college, it must be a black female, and because we are a conscious college talking about self-determination, we are talking about the appointment of a female that is indeed proven, not through words, but through history of action, a dedication to the black community. And then one other point I would like to make is on that word fascism. Hitler didn't come into being overnight. Hitler didn't just show up one day and then start exterminating Jewish people. There was a rise of Hitler. And I think that, people should study his rise, because when we talk about the press, to me, the press is now consolidated and controlled. It's no accident that the type of information we're receiving is the type of information we're receiving. And again, I have studied the history of Germany and the rise of Hitler, and it's not that very different, not just in foreign policy, but domestic policy, in terms of what is going on within the black and Latino and Chicano and Native American communities right here in these United States. We don't see policies that very different from what Hitler was implementing in Germany. The thing that's so similar is that while the majority just turned their faces and pretended that when a black child gets shot in the back by a policeman, it was an accident. It's not an accident. It's a part of a policy that allows this type of action to take place. And it is very important that people realize that we are living in some very, very dangerous times, and the only way it can be stopped is if we stand up and stop it.
And dangerous for us all. As you were speaking, Zala, I was thinking of Martin Niemöller, that quote from Martin Niemöller about Nazi Germany. First they came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so I didn't stand up. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't stand up. Then they came for the Catholics, and I wasn't a Catholic, so I didn't stand up. Then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't Jewish, so I didn't stand up. And then they came for me. There was nobody left to stand for me.
Well, thank you very much, Audre Lorde and Zala Chandler. I would just like to give you the address of the Fund for Open Information and Accountability so that you can get our fact sheet on Grenada. The address is 339 Lafayette Street, 10012. You can get our fact sheet just by writing for it and giving us a small contribution of your instinct. So we can keep up with our work and getting the details out to you. And our phone number is 212-477-3188. Again, thank you very much, Zala Chandler and Audre Lorde. This is Blanche Wiesen Cook, Women in the World in the 1980s.